You are listening to the US of NA, a series of stories about the founders and innovators shaping the non-alcoholic movement from every corner of the country and beyond. For a full library of episodes, go to usofna.com or make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Are you a brand looking to find enthusiasts nationwide to collaborate with and get liquid to lips? Or are you a fan of NA beverages open to sharing free samples with your run club or community group, or maybe getting paid to do in-store samplings? Then sign up at irlnation.com, the industry's first platform aimed at creating in-real-life partnerships in the category. Again, that's irlnation.com.
NA wine has a lot of room to grow still. We think that Shirley has a massive opportunity to continue growing in the national footprint we already have. However, I don't know that there's ever going to be an athletic brewing of NA wine, for instance. And so that category will continue growing. It'll, I think, keep taking some market share from wine and from other NA beverages. But I think long-term, low alcohol wine will carve out a meaningful segment of the wine business.
Welcome to the US of NA. I'm your host and chief optimist, John Eggleton. Today on the show, we have our first ever guest from the non-alcoholic wine space, Brandon Joldersma of Shirley and Arlo Wines. Been wanting to have this conversation for a while. You just heard him explaining his thoughts on the low alcohol space versus NA. So he leads a company that has two different brands, Shirley, which plays solely in the NA space, and Arlo, which is a newer brand that plays in the low alcohol space that they were helping to invent. NA wine is arguably the category that has been the hardest, I think, to get to significance versus, others in NA beer and spirits. In part just because of the winemaking process and the romance of wine, but also I think because of how the experience is perceived from a consumer end of things. So in our conversation, we get Brandon's very candid thoughts on the category opportunities, both the non-alcoholic as well as the low alcohol side. He's got some really interesting insights and opinions on that, just based on what they're seeing at both Shirley and Arlo. We also talk about some of the styles that their customers seem to be gravitating to, what demographics their consumers look like, and also, how they appeal or maybe not appeal to Gen Z. We talk a little bit about them, and there's been a lot of talk around how they are embracing or maybe not embracing wine, and so what that might look like in the no and low category. So hope you enjoy this conversation. Brandon Joldersma is the CEO of Austin, Texas-based Shirley and Arlo Wines. He's also a founder for the latter brand, Arlo. He has deep experience within the wine and spirits industry, having previously held leadership roles for Still Austin Whiskey Company, Coppercraft Distillery, and Virtue Cider. So, Brandon, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to the US of NA.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, first things first. So we usually like to open a bev from our guest brand. So I've got some of your Brut Sparkling Shirley from the Shirley brand in a can. So I'm going to go ahead and crack one of these open. And I think you got some on your end there too.
Yeah, I'll join you with a bottle of our sparkling rosé. It is early in the day, but it's non-alcoholic wine, so who cares?
Yeah, it's NA, so it's always 5:00 somewhere. So yeah, just to get things started. So as I mentioned at the top, I know you've worked in the wine and spirit space for a while. And I would love to just hear how you ended up in the no and low space. And now that I believe you're about a year or so in, what has maybe been the most surprising thing to you so far?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background on how I got into this. So the beginning of my career was in wine. So I worked as a sommelier and ran restaurants in my home state of Michigan in my early mid-20s. And wine was really the first beverage that I fell in love with, and it's remained my favorite. If I'm going to drink alcohol, I prefer wine over all the others. But my career kind of took some, twists and turns unexpectedly just because of opportunities that came up. And I ended up working in the hard cider, like you mentioned, and whiskey for a while. Loved what I was able to do in that space. But on the tail end of Still Austin, I knew I didn't want to go back into whiskey. If I took another kind of executive role in the whiskey industry, I'd be 10 plus years in that. And I thought I'd get branded as the whiskey guy at that point, which I didn't want. I kind of like being more well-rounded than that. And so I started kind of just looking kind of more in general into the CPG space. but I started looking at what was happening in wine. I hadn't paid a lot of attention to what was happening in the no and low space. Not I had tried Ariel like 15 years ago, and I was good on non-alc wine for the rest of my life, I thought. But I had known, the trends that were happening, right, with consumers. It started, 5-ish years ago or so with people drinking less and less. And so I was pretty intrigued by what was happening in the wine space there, and found this company, named Shirley, and ended up getting connected to the founders of the company. And uh, it just worked out that I kind of came in to take over a leadership and ownership role of Shirley. And then Arlo came about as another idea, which, I mean, we can dive more into that as we go on here. But yeah, took over running Shirley and then saw an opportunity in kind of the low alcohol wine space and created a new brand there.
Yeah, so it's a good segue. You have the two brands. So Shirley is the non-alcoholic brand. Arlo is the newer low alcohol brand. I believe all three of those wines are 6.5%. Is that right? Currently.
That's right. Yep.
So, half alcohol. And so I'd love to know, where the genesis, I guess, of that, both from a brand perspective and from a kind of product portfolio standpoint. So, the no and low space, as I want to get into a little bit later with you. I mean, as we're coming out of dry January, most of the numbers out there support the fact that the majority of people who are in the NA category are also drinking alcohol at other times. So it makes sense to have a low alcohol product, in that mix as well. So we'd just love to hear what some of those challenges are, and, what was the genesis behind, having that be its own brand? Was there any consideration maybe given to it becoming a sub brand of Shirley, or was there just maybe some concern over confusion between the two for people who may not be drinking at all?
Yeah, it was certainly that was the latter point there. We did explore like launching a subcategory of Shirley where we have a non-alc and then low alc line there. But we do, like you mentioned, the majority of our customers are people who still drink alcohol, but we do have a subset of customers who do not drink at all. And yeah, just didn't want to risk any consumer confusion there. You know, it was hard to figure out how to meaningfully differentiate those things in the packaging, for instance, and thought that it would be good for those to kind of stand on their own as separate brands.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. So you posted something we saw recently on LinkedIn that caught our eye. I think it was a Wall Street Journal article, talking about that very thing, that majority of the people who are in the category, it's more about moderation and mindful drinking. And there was another word that I think you referenced in your post that that caught my attention. And that was the word optimization, and which I like that word. I know there's a lot of words to describe, people that go back and forth. You hear about zebra striping, which I've never been a huge fan of personally. But optimization, that sounds interesting, because that's, people who are, as you explained it, are may still drink alcohol, but they're just very strategic about it. Maybe there's a point in time in which they want to enjoy a full alcohol beverage. Maybe there's other times where they want to enjoy NA, and maybe there's something times in which they want to enjoy something in the middle. So, just would love to hear your thoughts on that. I know last year we interviewed one of the co-founders of a company called Dad Strength Brewing. They're based in Washington, D.C. They're kind of the beer version of what you guys do, where they make IPAs that are, 2.5 to 2.9% alcohol. So very similar. Wine's a different category. There's always been the romance of wine and the winemaking process, kind of thing. So we just, love to hear your thoughts on that whole thing in terms of just, the no versus low.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I started diving into this category a little over a year ago, I was somewhat surprised to find that, I mean, the majority of people gravitating towards the non-alc sector are people who still drink alcohol. It's a lot of the press over the last, 5 years or so. And there's been a ton of press, especially, I mean, even in the last few months, just about people, how alcohol consumption is changing amongst consumers, not just even in the US, but worldwide. And I think people going sober is getting a lot of like disproportionate attention to the amount of people that are actually doing that versus people that are just moderating their consumption. I looked it up recently, in the difference between like 2018 and 2025 with people saying that they're abstaining from alcohol altogether went from something like 33% to 38%, right? So a modest increase over that period of time. And you wouldn't think that it would be that modest with all the press that sobriety has gotten recently. But for people abstaining from alcohol over that period of time, it doubled from like 32% to 64% or something like that. But those aren't exact figures that I'm saying right now. But so that to me is the real story here, right? So many consumers, I mean, two-thirds of consumers here in the US now reporting that they are actively planning on moderating their alcohol consumption in 2025. And like you said, that doesn't mean that they're, cutting it out altogether. It doesn't mean they're going to just drink non-alc. It doesn't mean they're just going to stick with full alc and drink it less often. I think options are what people are looking for. And, over 80% of Shirley's customers are people who still drink alcohol. And kind of it's not really a secret in the non-alc wine industry, but it is technically impossible to make non-alc wine taste exactly like a regular glass of wine, right? That is just something that this segment of the industry needs to acknowledge. You can make something that tastes great. You can make something that tastes wine-like, which I think, Shirley does. This is almost 100% wine, in here, but the process of dealcoholization changes the flavor of it fairly tremendously, and it's difficult to make a super high quality product doing that. And so, we're lucky we have a lot of internal expertise at Shirley to make a really high quality product in that segment. But we're never going to fool anybody blindfolded that this is a regular glass of wine, right? And it turns out that's what some consumers are looking for, right? They've even been conditioned to that to some degree, I think, by NA beer, which has been able to created like a near one-to-one. You could blindfold me and give me a Heineken 0.0, and I might not be able to tell the difference. Taking those two facts together, knowing that most people are just looking to moderate their consumption rather than cut it out altogether, and people really want something that tastes, could fool you that it's a regular glass of wine, it made sense to create Arlo, a brand that, it's half the alcohol, so 6.5%, like you mentioned. That also means it's half the calories. 2 out of 3 of our SKUs are zero sugar. So kind of an all-encompassing, like, better for you wine play. That does taste, turns out when you have half the alcohol, you can get not just half of the way there from a flavor perspective, but 80, 90% of the way there. And when I looked out to what was happening in the space, I was surprised that there aren't really, I think from the consumer perspective, there are not really any low alc wines out there right now. There are low calorie wines. There are diet wines, light wines. Some of the large conglomerates have like kind of line extensions where they dealcoholize down to 8% or 9%. But those all claim to be low calorie beverages, and that's their main value proposition. It turns out because they can't legally claim to be low alcohol wine at that ABV. And so, yeah, it felt like there's a tremendous opportunity for a brand to come along where their primary value proposition is that it is low in alcohol. And, like we're talking about, gives consumers more options.
For sure. So to the point you made about, wine, it's just, you're never going to be able to fool somebody in a blindfold test with between an NA wine and a regular wine. And, if you want to talk about the spirits category, which I know you have a lot of experience in, I mean, that would be the same as well. Although if you're mixing it with something, you really could. I mean, there's mocktails out there that, if you put a little bit of an NA spirit in there that maybe has a little bit of pepper or something to kind of mimic that burn, you can get pretty close. But wine is, it's going to be a little more difficult given that fact. I mean, do you guys believe that the low alcohol wine space could end up being bigger than the NA wine space, or how do you guys view those categories together?
That is my thesis. Yes. I think that NA wine has a lot of room to grow still. We think that Shirley has a massive opportunity to continue growing in the national footprint we already have, and we're pushing hard to do that. However, I don't know that there's ever going to be an athletic brewing of NA wine, for instance. And so that category will continue growing. It'll, I think, keep taking some market share from wine and from other NA beverages. But I think long term, low alcohol wine will carve out a meaningful segment of the wine business, which, I mean, even if that's a few percentage points, we're still talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's just something that, yeah, it's a category that does not exist right now. And I think with the trends that are happening, I think we can safely say that this moderation thing that's been happening in the last 5 years is not a fad, right? It's not like consumers are going to turn around all of a sudden and say, I was being mindful about my drinking, but now I'm just going to go ham. I think consumers are waking up to the fact that there's more calories than they thought in alcohol. That's still something I have that conversation with people all the time, and they're surprised to find out that ethanol itself has caloric content, and that's meaningful. How much it affects your sleep, how much it affects your workout recovery, like all of this, like that is not going to go away. And I don't think that, there's two extremes, I think, of what gets discussed in this industry. On one hand, I had somebody tell me a couple months ago that they think in 5 years, alcohol is going to be as demonized as cigarettes, right? Go down that same trajectory, which I don't think that's the case. Even if the Surgeon General gets what they want and we have to put cancer labeling on alcohol, like it's still not going to be viewed in the same as negative of a light as, cigarettes were in the last, 20 or 30 years or so. On the other hand, yeah, like I mentioned, I don't think it's just going to turn around and consumption will increase. There is this middle ground, I think, that will exist and will continue. This moderation thing is not going to stop. More and more people will be waking up to it, and the industry is going to suffer as a result, as it has been suffering the last 4 or 5 years. And I think brands in the NA and low alcohol space will continue thriving as that happens.
Definitely be interesting to see how that plays out. Let's transition and talk about the portfolio of products here a little bit. We'll start with Shirley, and I'm enjoying this Brut Sparkling. I think this was the only one of the sparklings for Shirley that I hadn't tried, so definitely enjoying this. I had the I think it was the sparkling red the other day with made a nice steak for dinner, and it really it was good on its own, and even added a little bit of all the bitters to it as well to give it a little bit of an extra bite to it. So a little shout out to the all the bitter team. But I love to experiment with that. But definitely, I mean, like you said, it's not. It didn't taste the same as a wine. It didn't taste like a regular Cabernet is going to taste, but or regular red would taste. But it certainly still complemented the food very well, and especially playing around with the bitters, it can almost kind of choose your own adventure with the taste a little bit, which is fun. But yeah, I would just love to hear you talk about the mix of products there for Shirley a little bit. I know it's the more mature brand. You have a few more products on that side. What kind of purchasing patterns are you guys seeing with that? What seems to be the favorites?
It's interesting that it kind of depends on the outlet that we're selling in, to a degree. But I will tell you in retail, which is the majority of our revenue last year was in retail, like through distribution. We're, nationally distributed and in Target, Sprouts, Total Wine and More, Bevmo, a few others. The cans do outperform the bottles so we have, 3 different SKUs in 4-pack cans and 5 or 6 SKUs or so in bottles, 750 milliliter bottles. And well, what's interesting about that, so that the cans turn a little bit faster on the shelf, and they're about the same price for the 4-pack of cans and the bottles on shelf, because that is not, I think, the same trend that is happening in the wine industry right now. I think canned wine in general has been struggling a little bit. And so I'd asked myself the last year, like, why is that? Why do our cans move more quickly? And what I can come up with is that, the wine segment in and of itself is so broad, right? You go to, say, Total Wine and More or something like that, and you're met with thousands of wine SKUs, and if you want to buy, a can of wine or, 4-pack of cans or whatever, you got to find that one shelf where they dedicated 4 to 8 feet of space, for that canned wine. The percentage of the overall category there is so small. But for us, often when people come to, say, Sprouts and they're looking for NA wine, we are a large chunk of that very small NA section, right? And often we might be we might be the only wine brand in that section or one of a few brands. And so I think with the consumer that we are resonating with the people that are looking for no and low, like that, our brand clicks a little bit faster and they have kind of a narrow option of purchasing just a few things. And so we see that turning a little bit faster than we would expect.
No, that's interesting. And going back to what we were talking about earlier about the optimization, I wonder if that's part of that as well, where, people are deciding what the mix of the beverages they're going to drink that night might be, and maybe they just want to have one glass of NA wine, so the can is maybe a little more attractive to them than drinking or buying a bottle or opening up a bottle of that. So I could see that being a factor.
Yeah, I think you're right that people are often they might be buying NA wine to have amongst friends, but they're buying it just for themselves, right? And you don't necessarily need to open a 750 milliliter bottle of wine just to drink yourself, even though it's NA, you know. But yeah, having a single serving, I think, helps.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk about Arlo a little bit. I know it's the newer brand. I believe you have the three still wine options: the Cabernet, as I mentioned, the Rosé, and the Sauvignon Blanc. I know that's not been in the market for very long as of yet, but what kind of sales trends are you guys seeing there in terms of feedback from consumers?
I think so. We started selling online in August, and we started selling through distribution in the state of New York in October. And really, what we've seen in terms of trends there is from when we launched to say once winter started, rosé just fell off a cliff, which I think would be expected. You know, in August and September, we saw some decent volume there. But both online and in the marketplace, now is just not the time for rosé. And the Cabernet sales took all of that share from that. Whereas the Sauv Blanc has kind of stayed steady. They're right in the middle. And so we anticipate, as things start warming up, which I mean, it's like 80 degrees today in Austin. So who knows when that's going to start happening, but we'll see those rosé sales start upticking again.
Right. What kind of crossover are you guys seeing between the two brands that you're able to track at least?
In terms of like where we're placed in retail,
Well, I guess in terms of people who are buying both.
that is a great question. And I don't know that we have a lot of data to answer that, to be honest. I mean, there's no outlets where they're sold together. So we can't really compare their sales, right? Their route to market is completely different right now. Different distributors, different retailers, different states, all of that. I will say, though, that the Shirley audience was very interested in Arlo when that came out. And that actually was part of the kind of proof that we needed that this was a good idea was we had polled Shirley's audience like a year and a half, 2 years ago or so to say, hey, what would you like to see next? And low alcohol wine was invariably the most popular thing. And so there is, I think, a lot of overlap between consumers that are interested in Shirley and that are now purchasing Arlo.
So to talk about demographics a little bit, so we were talking earlier just about overall trends in the category, and we're talking about people who are drinking alcohol during other times. There's a lot of there's always a lot of noise about Gen Z and their drinking habits, and it feels like every dry January that's always a huge point of discussion. Is it's being driven by Gen Z. When we've had people either on the show or even just talking to people in real life, it feels like the people who are really shopping in this category are tend to be a little bit older.
Mhm.
Millennials, we see and hear a lot about that. We've seen for ourselves in at different events that 55, 60 plus is a huge, feels like growing demographic. Pushing into this category as well. I mean, they want to live more healthy lifestyle, just like everybody else. So they're definitely pushing. And they certainly have more disposable income than somebody who might be in their late 20s. And these products are priced very similarly to any other alcohol counterpart. So just curious what you guys are seeing that you're able to share in terms of who's buying, either or both of these brands from a demographic standpoint.
For Shirley, the demographic outlay is primarily women between the age of 35 and 55 is what we see. And disposable income, like you mentioned, is definitely a factor there. However, I've been surprised at the amount of like you said, maybe 55 plus, 65 plus that are interested in this. I think they are starting to, and that is I think the older demographic that wine sales are not declining in. It is the only one, I believe. And so we're experiencing relatively strong sales with that group. Same thing with Arlo. I think it's trended a little bit older than I expected, to be honest. But we're seeing kind of a similar overlap between the audience of people who are interested in buying Shirley and the people that are buying, Arlo, as we mentioned. I think with Gen Z, it's a tough thing to tackle right now because you kind of got to take a step back and not just ask, okay, why are they not drinking wine and what can wine do to appeal to Gen Z? we gotta say, what can alcohol do to appeal to Gen Z? They are not drinking alcohol at all, or I mean, much, much less than any previous generation that I think we have on record in terms of their drinking habits. And I'm not sure that I'm in a position with the company where I'm clamoring to try and sell alcohol to people who don't want it. There's something that feels slightly off there. I think for us with Arlo, part of the reason that wines is struggles with younger consumers, and I think maybe especially with Gen Z, though if I had to answer the question, it's that industry more than any other in the alcohol industry, I think is wrapped up in a lot of pretension. You It's very intimidating, wine is for a lot of consumers. The learning curve is much, much greater than it is with beer, and with liquor, although there's a lot to learn about all different types of alcohol. But I think with wine, it's like, okay, do I have to know what all these grapes are supposed to taste like? Do I need to have tasting notes? Do I need to know what this pairs with? Do I need to know this American vinicultural area that this is from? Do I need to know if this vintage is good or bad? Those are all really, really complicated things to wrap your head around. Whereas I think with younger consumers, what we try to do deliberately with Arlo, and maybe this sounds like a funny thing to say, but I say I personally drink Arlo like I drink Miller Lite. And it's actually the beer I drink most often, I think. But it's the beer I drink when I don't want to feel overly full. I don't want to get drunk. I don't want to have to think too much about what I'm drinking. I don't need to pair it with specific types of food. I just want good beer and that's it. Like, I don't want to think about it. I think Arlo can do that for wine. And I think you actually see that trend happening with other emerging wine brands that are targeting younger consumers, is taking the pretension out of it, saying, hey, you don't need to learn all of this information about it. Just drink good wine. And for us, like, I think Arlo, first and foremost, you could just say that, hey, this is good wine. Just drink this. And after that, you can say, oh, also, it happens to be half the alcohol, half the calories, and 0 to low sugar, low sulfites, all of that, sustainably farmed, those sorts of things. So that's kind of the angle we're trying to go with Arlo.
Hmm. Now, to your point, there does seem to be a lot of things happening in the wine category with Gen Z that, go outside of the no and low. Are they finding their way to the category? Are they intimidated by it? And I don't know, to some extent, maybe that's a little bit generational as newer, younger generations enter drinking age, and maybe eventually as they get into their 30s, which I don't think Gen Z is there yet. Maybe at some point that will change, but they're obviously coming into that category or coming into that age demographic at a time when just overall drinking habits are different. So it might be hard to separate those two. And it struck us, we had a conversation last year with Rob Theodoro at Generation NA in Indiana, and he was talking about when people come into his NA bottle shop, when it's a younger person, either Gen Z or a young millennial, it's all about the function. They want to buy a beverage for, either to chill or, they're looking for low calorie, or they're looking for, some sort of a, something for energy or what have you. And it's just interesting the difference there between that and, you talked about when you have somebody coming in who's maybe in their 40s or 50s, it's, what do you have that tastes like a bourbon? Or, they're looking for that one-to-one replacement because that's just how people are wired, or
Yep.
have been for so many years around alcohol. And these Gen Z people just they don't have that. They don't have that constriction, which is a good thing for them. I'm happy for them to come into the category and have so many more options than we did, or at least I did when I came into it. So.
Yep.
So, last question I have for you. I know you're, about a year or so into your role, and what are your long-term goals do you like to see for both the Shirley and Arlo brands, and in terms of where they'll fit in the market? Now, you've talked a little bit already about Arlo and where each of those two tend to play, and what about the overall no and low wine category? Where would you like to see that go in the next few years?
I think I'd like to see NA over the next few years established as a legitimate, even if small, component of the wine industry. I think the industry at large is still very skeptical about this, I think the first question you asked what's been most surprising about this, and I don't think I answered that, And so I could come full circle here and book into this call by saying, I've worked in alcohol my whole adult life, and I mean, I'm very familiar with how the industry operates, both distributors and retailers and all of that. But I have been really surprised at the level of resistance to no and low products with those segments of the industry. It is they do not understand what is happening right now with consumers largely, and they're also not interested in figuring out for the as far as I can tell, they're not terribly interested in figuring out how to fix this, which that might be unfair to some retailers. I think they're being more proactive, but largely with distributors that I've talked to, no interest in exploring what's happening here in this space. And so I would like non-alc wine to be more legitimized, like in this space for the legacy industry players to understand that, hey, this is not going away. Like this is a meaningful part of this industry, and you can be successful by being forward thinking and taking advantage of this. And with Arlo, I mean, I really believe that we are establishing a new category of wine, like here in the United States. Like I mentioned before, low alcohol wine is not something that exists for consumers. And that is something that's been validated over and over and over when I have the opportunity to interact directly with consumers and taste them on the product. I was in New York last week and did an event at the Soho House in Dumbo and probably tasted, I don't know, 75 people or so. And it is just remarkable. Like, one, people are like, oh, whoa, low alcohol wine. What's that? Like, it's a new concept for everybody. And you explain it to them very quickly and they get to taste it and it clicks, you know? Now, from there, going consumer to consumer like that is one thing, but it's going to be challenging, the next few years to continue legitimizing that category on a national scale and getting consumers, one, just aware of the category and what it is, and then also believing that it's going to taste great, and knowing that it tastes very, very similar to a regular, glass of wine.
Well, Brandon, we really appreciate you taking the time. As I mentioned to you before, you were our first guest from the wine space, so really appreciated diving into this with you, and we look forward to having more of these conversations here in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, John. It was a good time.
All right. I want to again thank Brandon for being our first NA Wine guest. What was interesting to me about his perspective is that he's both a CEO who took over the reins from a founder. I was on the Shirley side, as well as being a founder himself on the Arlo side. So what I mean by that is I think he has both an outsider as well as an insider perspective that applies to his views of to both sides of the low and no alcohol category overall. We've got new episodes coming up soon that we're excited about, so please make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you may be listening to this. And until next time, cheers.